Hello, and welcome to the No Bad Questions podcast, where I try to learn in a conversational manner by sitting down with people who have interesting careers, important lessons to tell, or inspiring stories. I hope that you learn something too. If you want to support the podcast, please follow or subscribe on your platform of choice. You can also like or comment to boost the algorithms or share out to your network to make sure it gets more views. But ultimately, and what I hope you choose to do, is listen to the very end. With that, we'll start today's podcast. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of the No Bad Questions podcast. My guest today is entrepreneur John Williamson. John has been building software platforms for the last 20 years, spending the last 10 focused in healthcare revenue cycle. He got his first introduction to the world of denials and appeals, building tools for providers at a company called Waystar. He then built a startup company that developed intelligent robotic process automation, or RPA, which we may get into today, and document extraction capabilities to help billing companies automate processes to service their customers at a lower cost. John recently launched his newest startup, Lockbox AI, using technology to help healthcare providers clean up their old accounts receivable and streamline collection efforts. John has been living in the world of AI and RPA technology for the last 5 years and is excited about the promise, but pragmatic in his assessment of where we are today. And that's actually why I asked him to come on and talk with me. So, John, thanks for being with me here on No Bad Questions.
Absolutely, David. Excited to be here.
So to start out with, because I think it's everywhere these days between ChatGPT and just, I think, salespeople kind of wanting the new shiny in their marketing materials. What is AI to your mind?
Sure. So there's this definition that seems to hold water over time pretty well, which is that AI is whatever technology can do that used to be attributed to a human, and that is always a moving target. Because as we get used to it, it's not AI anymore. It's got to be the next new thing is AI. So the sort of the goalpost does shift, but generally speaking, it's using language, or it's using vision, or it's using predictions, something in one of those categories.
Interesting. So the concept of the definitional goalposts of AI being so movable is to me a really interesting definition to it, because I think a lot of other folks would perhaps pin it down a little bit more. But to me, that moving goalpost definition actually helps explain why it has morphed and changed and mutated over the last few years in terms of articles I read in the healthcare space, articles I read outside of the healthcare space. But I feel like that might make it more difficult for people who aren't, building AI like yourself, who aren't entrepreneurs, who aren't data scientists, to get their heads around it. Do you feel like that moving definition harms people's mental adoption or actual process adoption of AI? And if so, what could be done about that?
Some of the AI tools that we experience in our everyday lives, we don't even think about as AI any longer. So, it's the recommendations on YouTube, or your channel list on Spotify, or your recommendations of related products on Amazon. Those kinds of things that are sort of simple AI, tools we don't even think of anymore. When folks are adopting, though, you're really looking for smart technology. I mean, you could almost change the definition a little bit to say, how smart is the technology and how is it going to help me? So, something that's not very smart is just dividing something up based on data that it's already given. Something that's a little bit smarter might say, okay, well, I can group these things together without being explicitly told what the grouping is, and maybe group work queues or those kinds of things. Or maybe I can look at a knowledge base to then infer predictions from it. So it's sort of this laddering effect of intelligence in the software. But I don't know that someone should get overly caught up in, is this strong AI? Is this weak AI? Does this count as AI? Does it not count as AI? In some ways, I think that might be a distraction from what is it doing for me that I couldn't do before? And maybe just that simplified reframing can cut through some of the marketing noise that's out there.
That makes sense. And as you mentioned there, strong AI and weak AI. Can you kind of break those down for people?
Well, the stuff that's in the news, the ChatGPT and what Microsoft just announced, integrating this into their Word products. And I think Google also announced something integrated into their Google Workspace to do generative AI. And the generative AI, the only reason it works very well is because it has been trained on just an ungodly amount of data with a lot of horsepower behind it. And that's something that an average company isn't going to be able to do. So that you might consider strong AI right now, in that it is really doing a lot of steps for you automatically, versus something that is weak might just be clustering things together based on similarity. So you've got things that are simple but could still be effective, versus things that are quite complex but maybe unnecessary in certain circumstances.
Okay. And does that have to do, one of the things I feel like I'm decently well educated in this universe, although I'm not as deep into it as you are, but one of the things I've struggled to break out is AI versus machine learning. And I feel like a lot of people use these interchangeably, perhaps incorrectly so. So is one a subset of the other, or can you speak to that then? Because I think a lot of, particularly in our healthcare space that you and I are in, but in general, people talk about machine learning as often probably as that generic moving goalpost term AI. But again, I think they use it interchangeably. Is that appropriate to do, or what is the difference?
Well, machine learning is a subcategory of AI. So AI is pretty broad. So in the world of machine learning, typically you're saying I have training data and and the actual outcome of that training data. So A plus B equals C, and I'm going to train on those outcomes to be able to predict C even before I know it. So that's oftentimes think like predicting denials, predicting how long it's going to take to get paid on a claim from a given insurance company, those kinds of things where you've trained on. That's really just machine learning. Then AI is much broader. So that incorporates that, but it also incorporates things like computer vision. So some of the RPA functions out there that you might hear, RPA, AI-powered RPA, oftentimes what it's mostly referring to is the fact that it's using computer vision. So it's taking pictures of whatever it's navigating on the screen and extracting that and realizing what that is. Oh, I need to click here, select this option in the drop down, those kinds of things. So the AI being the broad category, which includes multiple things, versus machine learning being the subcategory. Machine learning is the more commonly used and implemented tool set right now. But the computer vision is also pretty important when it comes to some RPA. If you're, for example, running RPA on top of Citrix, for example. So a lot of folks are using Citrix for security. You have to use a lot of computer vision, which is a different type of AI, but not machine learning. So those are areas where you'll see sort of the subset machine learning and the superset AI.
Okay. And one of the phrases I've heard is unattended algorithms. Is that then a subset inside of machine learning where it's unattended, meaning you don't have to have a human constantly feeding it data? It's maybe getting data from a feed, from an API, from, some database, the electronic medical record, whatever, and it is sort of teaching itself. Is that what that means? And I'm, with all these questions, I am headed to a point, but I want to set the framework for folks who maybe aren't as well versed in this. Yeah.
So, and I'm not a data scientist myself, so I'm giving you the sort of productization version of this. So
sure.
You could say attended versus unattended, but you could also say supervised versus unsupervised. So the unsupervised versus supervised is one of the more core tenets. And so supervised is more simplistic. and more common, where I say, consider these 5 fields and try and predict this other field. So it's only the algorithm is only going to look at those 5 fields and try and create that prediction, and then it's going to train, and then it's going to move on. And it's during the training process, typically the word attended and unattended kind of has some multiple use cases, but during the training process, it may be completely manual to say, okay, well, let me try algorithm A, that's okay quality. Algorithm B, oh, that's better quality. Algorithm C, oh, that's the best quality. Let's use that one. That would be, maybe you might call that attended and supervised, meaning I picked the fields and I picked which algorithm works best. An automated ML, an auto ML process would say it's going to go through all the different options itself and pick the best algorithm that had the best outcome and automatically implement that. So that would be automated machine learning, but using a supervised set of source data. Then you move into the unsupervised, where you're saying, okay, consider everything, or maybe just a larger set of things more than just my hand-picked, cherry-picked number of fields, and just go to town. So it has more options. You might think of, I always think back to this, some sign I saw, I think I saw it at a Subway or something, where it talked about the number of combinations of sandwiches you could create with just maybe there's 30 ingredients, but you could create, a billion different options of sandwiches or something like that.
Right.
But so you can imagine that the more fields that an algorithm has to pick from, the more challenging it is to predict the outcome. Now, it will find things you wouldn't have discovered on your own, that you thought fields 1 through 5 were the best predictors of this outcome, but it turns out fields 1, 3, and 17, plus some other things, become better in this algorithm. So that unsupervised machine learning, which can also be manually, you can pick the right algorithm, or automatically it can cycle through multiple and try multiple on its own and then pick the right one. So there's a few different scenarios there. The supervised and manually trained is the sort of lowest common denominator. And it's usually trained at one point in time, and then you can update it. You may have it auto refresh itself so that it says, not every second am I retraining myself, but maybe every week or every month or every quarter, I'm going to take an updated data set, look at those, and try and update my model to get better at prediction with the new data. So a few variables to consider in there.
Okay. So I think we've broken out a number of definitions here, which is great. Thank you for going remedial for me, and for the audience. And so the next thing is, both in healthcare and I'm guessing beyond, from some folks I've talked to in other industries, everybody is out there with an AI, air quotes, tool or product offering. But some of it, I have to wonder, is it smoke and mirrors? Some of it, is it really AI? Is it, or is it the new snake oil, right? And it'll cure what ails you. And so, given your experience, what advice to people out there, and obviously you and I are going to lean our advice towards the healthcare space, but what advice do you have to ask of people who are coming to the table? Hey, I got a cool new product. We do cool new things, and we'll make everything in your life better. What should people be asking those business development people, those salespeople? How can they sort of separate the wheat from the chaff?
That's a big conversation, and I think that it may vary a bit depending on exactly the use case.
Okay, fair enough.
And then there's sort of, okay, well, the problem with a lot of AI components is, if your goal is to just improve something, okay, that's achievable. If your goal is to have a perfect outcome, that's almost unachievable, and you're going to have to do something like have a human in the loop. And then questions come up about whose human is that? Is that the client human? Is that the vendor human? And I think one of the first questions that you might want to ask of a vendor is, who's doing the training of the data? Is it the vendor or the client? And if there's going to be a human judgment on something, who's doing that? Is it Is it my human as the client, or is it your human as the vendor behind the scenes? So I think getting sort of clarity on, is there a human in the loop, is one of the components that is important to ask about. Another is to just get a clear explanation of where the AI is. So you may have a solution that touches, 10 different areas, but the AI is actually only in this one corner. And I think getting clarity around where is the AI and being able to get a clear, specific answer on that is one way to start to filter out, okay, is this, you wrapped the air quote AI around your entire solution, but really it's just an AI classifying this thing in the background that I would never even know about had you not told me. So I think just getting some specificity around where is it and what is it doing, and based on what it's doing, is there a human component to it, and whose human is that? So those are the types of questions I'd try and get down to and see if you can get specific answers in a straightforward way. If you can't get a straight answer on those sort of two areas of where is it, what does it do, and is there a human and who's human? If you can't get a straight answer on that, then that kind of answers your question of, okay, well, this was mostly marketing, versus something real.
No, that makes a ton of sense, and I think provides some good questions out there for people. One of the things that it seems to me to be the case is that AI, whether machine learning or otherwise, RPA for automating processes, really needs scale to earn its money back. And maybe that's not true, but so I'd like to sort of pick your brain on that. And again, it may vary by use case, obviously, but I've talked to some guests here from rural healthcare or smaller size healthcare systems, and some folks from very large health systems. Is there a floor to your mind for where AI unfortunately stops making sense?
Yeah. Well, exactly to your point, and really AI is the goal of AI is to help with automation. Now, some automation is just, you don't need AI to do it, but the goal is to sort of have more and more advanced automation. But if you're not doing something very often because you're, a rural hospital, or you're a small doctor practice, whatever it is, you're just not going to get the value out of that. The cost of implementing the tool from the vendor is going to be higher than the savings resulted from it, especially if your human still has to be in the loop. And I think this, going back to the questions to ask, matters a lot. So for example, if you're going to implement a tool that still requires you to have a person on staff to double check the tool because it can't be perfect, it's just making a suggestion, well, then did you really save anything? Okay, well, then now that human's more productive, but you still have to pay for that human. So now you just have the human plus the cost of the software. Some cases, maybe that makes sense that human really didn't have the time or the skills to do their job very well. But when you actually don't get to get rid of any FTEs, then what have you saved? Versus the vendor employs a human, probably offsite, out of sight, out of mind, that's going to double check the outcome. Well, then the ROI may be there. So I think when it gets down at the margin, sort of at low volume, who's human in the loop, that's super critical. And I think you're going to start to see, and there's already vendors out there that will take the human in the loop process and own that themselves as part of the solution. And that increases the ROI, especially on the smaller scale.
Makes a ton of sense. And part of me feels that's unfortunate, because I think it's the smaller physician offices, the smaller hospitals that need so much help these days. They can't find the people to do the work. They could really benefit from automating processes or getting good data analysis, because maybe they can't find really, rock star data analysts to come in and do something and look at their data manual and say, hey, here's where we've got some leaks, and therefore could just benefit more than maybe a big shop that has more resources to throw at things. So that does make me a little sad that there's that floor on scalability, but it makes sense. And I can't help but wonder if there's some sort of future where small organizations, rural hospitals of America or whatever could co-op or, into some sort of data tool. Are you seeing anything like that emerging to help the smaller guys?
Well, going back, I really do think the best place to be in. So from a vendor perspective, you have a choice of, am I going to have services behind my software to help run my software for the client, or am I going to train the client to do it themselves? And I think if your goal is to not sell to the big guys, if you want to go medium and small, then you need to bring the labor with you. And so I think maybe as kind of the opposite view of the optimistic view, I should say, of this for the small guy is, whether you're a rural hospital or an individual independent medical practice, is that you don't have to hire certain roles. You can essentially outsource that to an AI assisted vendor. So you could think of, if I'm going to outsource to a vendor, you have traditional outsourcing, which is sort of pure labor. Now, most of the vendors are implementing some degree of automation to benefit their own bottom line. But that's where you might also want to think, if you're looking to outsource a function, what tools is this vendor using that makes them better at that function than the next guy? Maybe even they price it the same. So if I outsource it to a traditional vendor who's purely labor, often offshore, it's going to be X thousand dollars a month, versus this other vendor, which has more AI components, more automation components, and requires less labor. Maybe it's the same price. But if you're making a decision as a medical practice or a rural group, you probably should go with the technology assisted, the AI assisted vendor who's bringing their own humans, so you don't have to fill that role. But they're actually using technology the way it should be used and continuing to invest in that. I do think there is a bifurcation of vendors who, the ones that have sort of, and you hear this a lot in AI, whose jobs is this going to replace? Well, it's going to replace the folks who don't adopt the AI. It's not going to replace all the jobs, just the jobs of the people who didn't sort of jump on board. So I think when you're doing vendor selection, you should use the vendor who brings their own human. So they're using their own tool set, number one, and the one who's heavily investing in new technology. I honestly think that is a way for you to filter out the vendors, and also get the ROI on having to hire someone to do every single little job that you may not need a full-time person for.
I think that's a great point. When and well beyond healthcare, if somebody's looking to hire out, looking to outsource, looking to, bring a vendor in to provide a tool to their business or a service to their business, is that tool or service empowered by some level of AI? Keeping in mind the questions you mentioned earlier, who's human, where exactly does the AI fit in the process? Keeping in mind those sort of cut through the bowl type questions, and then saying, yeah, but if you don't have any tech enablement, any AI enablement, are you really even going to be able to compete and provide the outcomes that are needed in the modern age? I think that is a really interesting point and a good point for people to think about as they're going out and getting bidders for things across industries.
Yeah.
Are you worried about any elements of the AI future? And so this is like, I think where some of the skepticism about AI comes from is we've all seen Terminator too many times. We've all watched too many movies, the rise of the machines type of deal. And I mean, I haven't vetted it, but I mean, I saw an article from a week ago that Chat GPT, I think somebody was running an experiment to see what it would do, but Chat GPT hired somebody to solve a CAPTCHA, one of those little things that says identify the bicycles or whatever to prove you're not an AI. And the reason I think this was an experiment was that somebody was looking under the hood of the Chat GPT's reasoning as it thought through this, because I guess the person it was trying to hire said, well, are you a robot? Basically, ha ha ha, that you can't solve a CAPTCHA. And right. Chat GPT's reasoning was, well, I shouldn't admit that I'm a robot if I want to solve the CAPTCHA. So, and it wants to solve the CAPTCHA.
Yeah.
So it lied to a human and said, "Oh, I have bad vision. I've got eye problems." And the person did the CAPTCHA for them. Now, A, I've not vetted this story. I just heard it. But B, if it's true, that gets into some movie plot style. It's lying to humans. It's getting to stuff it's not supposed to get to or whatever. On the other hand, we know that some tools put barriers in front of RPA that we'd like to break down those barriers so that RPA can work, so we can automate the things that are automatable.
Right.
So to me, that story is both a bit of a fear-inducing one as well as an inspiring one about where the technology can go to try to break down barriers in automation. How do you take a story like that? Do you think we should be afraid? Where do you think things are going, over a 5-year time horizon?
Oh, it's a good question. And the reality is, the more tools you give the good guys, the more good things they're going to do. The more tools you give the bad guys, the more bad things they're going to do. And so I don't know that, I don't know that you can have it both, just only get the good stuff or only see the bad stuff. So unfortunately, I think, yes, we're going to see bad stuff, but also at the same time, yes, we're going to see good stuff. The RPA automation, so the sort of multi-factor authentication and those kinds of barriers are there. And yes, there are workarounds. So sometimes it requires doing a couple extra things to be able to automate a system that didn't want to have a bot working in it. But you're doing that for the good of the outcome. You're really not doing that for a nefarious reason at all.
Right.
So I think that putting up barriers is going to get more complicated. So this sort of, pick the bicycles, respond to a text message, those kinds of things probably will work for a while, but will not work against a really determined actor, whether that actor is good or bad. And so that can be challenging, right? So it ends up coming back to basic blocking and tackling security, and, people are updating their passwords and those kinds of things, so you're not just relying on, can you pick the bicycles as your only stopgap? Because there's just not going to be stopping some of this stuff from getting through. But sometimes it's for the right reasons, that you want the bot to be able to log in and do the thing, because that's the only way the thing is going to get done in a timely fashion and keep us in business.
Yeah. Yeah. And as a mild tangent, I heard, again, unvetted, that a few years ago, whoever sort of sells and embeds the main CAPTCHA tools, we're all training self-driving AI anyway when we do those, ironically, because I guess somebody licensed that to some of the folks developing self-driving cars. That's why they're all bicycles and buses and crosswalks and stoplights, these days. Whereas if you think back 10 years to when CAPTCHAs first came around, they might have fire hydrants or, I don't know, airplanes. Now it's all like roadworks based stuff. So I don't know if that's true, but if so, it's sort of funny enough that we've got AI trying to defeat AI while we're all trying to teach the AI how to, recognize the road hazards. It's this weird.
Well, there's another story that happened in that too. So that so Google owns the company reCAPTCHA. I think they bought it a while back, and they had this big project of taking old books and scanning them and OCRing them so that they could digitize them. So the words you used to see not that long ago, there were words that you would type out what you saw. And those were words that were snippets out of the scanned books that the OCR had trouble with. And so they would present those to multiple people. And once they had confirmation from, 2 or 3 or 4 people on an individual word, they would then use that as the OCR output. So we were very literally doing the OCR work for these old books that were being scanned that they did. That's why that's the outcome. So we actually already were doing that, even pre-self-driving, just in that type of work.
I'd never heard that. That is fascinating. And like stealth crowdsourcing, essentially sounds like. Let me pivot now, as we get into sort of the second half of our conversation, just to your background. You said earlier, hey, I'm not a data scientist, but and yet you have started several AI or AI related or AI adjacent companies. So how did you get, if you're not a data scientist, how'd you get into doing all this work and starting up all these companies?
Well, so my history in software and entrepreneurship. So I've been in software for 20 years. So started a company while in college, and back then, this was 2003. We started to get some bigger B2B projects, and it was all about enabling what I would call multi-party workflow and putting it on the internet. So in 2003, 4, 5, a lot of tools that we take for granted being on the internet now were not. Especially for individual companies. There were a few internet websites out there, but it wasn't a lot of sort of enterprise software wasn't on the web. So we were building the web-enabled version of software that allowed 2 or 3 different vendors to work together on to get we did one that was for training commercial truck drivers at a bunch of different locations and tracking their expenses and hotel stays and all this stuff. And it required like 4 different vendors to work together in real time. And it fundamentally changed how a very large multi-billion-dollar trucking company ran. And I was really just blown away by the impact that putting sort of workflow into a web browser and having multiple parties contribute to the workflow, it just had such a big impact. And that was really exciting. And so ever since then, I've been in the world of sort of designing and building software tools, oftentimes multi-party, because that's where it gets really valuable. You don't need just a new notepad for yourself. You need a tool that allows you and your vendor and your customer to sort of interface in some way. And so the evolution of that, as you I got into healthcare 10 years ago, and that is where I started to see the problems in healthcare. I really didn't know anything about healthcare, much less rev cycle specifically prior to that. But I got dropped into the deep end of here's where things go wrong with denials. And so this was building sort of workflow tools to help triage and automate a subset of the responses to denials, which I didn't realize how valuable that was and how big of a deal that was until we started seeing it being used and started to see the alternatives. Because for a lot of people in the healthcare space, they're using their EHR and reports from their EHR as their workflow. And it surprised me, to be honest, because you hear about the price tags of the EHR tools. And of course, a lot of times we hear about the Epics and Cerners of the world, but there's a whole bunch of other, especially the specialty oriented EHRs that, they're all about the clinical experience and capturing fields. Most of them were built, in the 2000s or sometimes earlier and adapted a little bit, but haven't been updated very much. And they never put much emphasis on the revenue cycle side of things. So here's a report to data dump some stuff. And basically everyone picked up reports, went to Excel and had to go practice their Excel skills and copies of Excel and all this goofy stuff. Sometimes, you put it on a OneDrive. Often you don't. You have versioning. And so that was the state of the art, even in the mid 2010s. In the late 2010s, 2017 is the first time I saw robotic process automation being used in support of RevCycle. And it was kind of eye-opening to say, oh, here are specific use cases where bots could go help do a repetitive task in support of the people who are still working out of spreadsheets. So being able to automate the process of running bots and pulling the data back or synthesizing data from a couple different places, reconciliation and posting where you pull bank deposits and sometimes scan DOBs, and then you go into the EHR and do posting and balance transfers and all this stuff. It wasn't that I said, oh my gosh, I got to go get into AI. Actually, it was more automation than really AI, but that's just kind of automation sort of gets tucked into AI, especially for marketers. But then what happens is you hit these little practical roadblocks. So for example, in the world of implementing RPA, if you're working with certain clients, I mentioned the Citrix thing earlier, you have to implement computer vision tools to figure out what you're looking at and where you're supposed to click. Very basic needs, right? You don't even think about that when you're saying RPA. I need to actually understand the screen and what's on the screen, especially if it's through a pane of glass in Citrix. I can't just scan it and look at it. So you start to get into computer vision there. And then we got into, we need to extract PDF documents. And we don't just need to extract them. We need to pull all the specific data off of them, map them to, corresponding patients and encounters, and this number goes with this charge code and so on and so forth, to be able to then go do the posting. So in some ways, it wasn't that I said, oh my gosh, let me go get into AI. It was a subset of how can we make multi-party workflow be smarter, and you hit the edge of what a machine can do, and then you need to keep adding to it. So that's kind of the evolution of it. And then more recently, in my current company, which I started building out a couple of years ago, the core platform, one of the things that my most important, maybe the most important, but one of the top things was I did not want to have to educate an engineer about U.S. healthcare. I didn't want to have to talk to them about EOBs and RARC codes and CART codes and PLB segments and E35s. That's just too much, right? That's almost impossible. So I needed a tool set that I could control with no code. I'm not a coder, to be able to configure and own, and then reconfigure and add to over time, because you don't know everything you're going to need day one. And then as part of that, you want to say, well, what can I predict? So there's the low-hanging fruit, like, can I predict a denial based on who I'm billing and what I'm billing them, right? So I can start to predict that.
Right.
But how do you do that? It's got to be simple, right, for a no-code environment to do. So that's when I got into doing, let me pick the fields, and then I'll pick what I'm trying to train, and then we're going to have an automated supervised machine learning process that uses these fields but picks its own model and then implements it. So that's kind of where AutoML is tied in. And then I want to also incorporate that into workflow. So one of the holy grails in workflow is to be able to dumb it down, which is to say, okay, I can give you a work queue. How much can I optimize that work queue? Can I make it more like a factory floor? Like, there's 1,000 things to do and there's 5 of us. So can it group the work together and then distribute it in a way that makes sense, so that what you're working on today is similar. All the items in the batch are similar to each other for a variety of reasons. So clustering, another little small miniature AI component there. And then the next level is, can I suggest what to do? So can I give you the right account at the right time and suggest what to do? Okay, so that suggesting what to do means you have to get the training data for that. So that is all about, as you do your work and you select, here's what I did for this account and it resulted in a positive payment, that output of that workflow becomes the training data for the prediction. So now, instead of just predicting whether it got denied or not, now I can predict what you should do about it for this circumstance. So you get into kind of another prediction, but crowdsourced. To your comment earlier, you're crowdsourcing the labels that you needed to say, what did you do that led to the proper outcome? And then next time I can suggest that to the next guy who may be completely brand new to RevCycle, right? So you end up with a lot of churn and a lot of different people looking at accounts. How simple can I make it? And then the final step, well, if I know what to do with a reasonably high degree of confidence, can I just go ahead and do it via automation? Can I skip the human in the loop step? Some cases that's okay to do, some cases that's not okay. If it's, okay, well, I think I'm probably going to have to go grab document A out of the EHR, claim status over here, and timely filing situation over here, I can go ahead and do that without any consequence. If you're more in the world, for example, of coding, and I say, well, I think it's probably, this E&M code with this modifier. Yeah, but are you really sure? You're probably still going to keep the human in the loop. So there are this sort of evolution from workflow to smarter workflow to how do you break down the little walls in the workflow, and you end up implementing least my experience, was not let's go do AI because it's sexy. It was let's implement tools that break down walls in workflow is really where it's all originated from.
Okay. So that's what brought you to it. What advice would you have to others looking to get into either young folks entering the workforce or somebody mid-career who's maybe looking for a change? What advice would you have to folks looking to get into, the technical solutions, the AI software platform universe? As of this recording, anyway, it's been a rough couple months for tech in general. But what advice? I mean, is it just a bad time to get in, or do you still have a lot of confidence in the tech side of things? What's your advice to folks looking to pursue that as a career path?
Well, I would say actually, the stock market may not be doing so great, and the company value, you didn't want to raise money in 2021 and go raise more money now. You'd be really disappointed. So it's better to start now than it was to start 2 years ago. Another thing, the paradigm shift, and really OpenAI, ChatGPT was the thing that got us all talking about it and forced folks who were in R&D mode to publish product, is really amazing. So in the last 1 week, I've seen both Microsoft and Google announce the implementation of large language models inside their equivalent versions of documents in Word or Google Docs or Excel and Google Sheets, to be able to do things that would have required you couldn't have done before. Whether it's writing for you or generating tables and graphs and pivots that you never would have, maybe you knew how to do that, maybe you didn't. So these capabilities are being really democratized. So I think maybe now it's not so much about building the raw technology as much as it is about integrating the tools that are now becoming available and doing that in a way that's, for a specific use case. So I think your sort of sandbox just got some new toys in it. And so if you're starting now with your awareness of what the toys are and what they can do, or getting to know what they can do, you're now miles ahead of a company that started 3 years ago, because they didn't have those toys to play with. And so they built in direction A, and now you can leapfrog them in direction B and sort of get to a better value proposition, better, faster, cheaper than you would have just a few years ago.
Okay. So in some ways, these items becoming public are going to be launch pads for folks looking to get into this, either to do startups in this area or joining startups and helping that startup take off a little bit more quickly, if I'm hearing you right.
Yeah. You brought up something
last
earlier.
Up then, let me add, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to build on something you meant earlier, sort of the co-opting of tools. And I think that another thing that I think is a good opportunity to focus on. So there are tools that might be too cumbersome or expensive for one individual medical practice, let's say, to take advantage of. But there's a lot of other medical practices just like them. And so whether it's the vendor sponsoring the first version or whatever it is, being able to share resources that have been customized for a specific use case and being able to make them generic and then accessible to lower tier. So if you think that all the fancy toys used to only be available to the big companies, the big health systems, we're kind of going down market here where fancier toys, better automation, better AI is becoming available at a lower cost. And you could take that to the next logical step of, okay, well, maybe we can split the cost. So maybe we want to build, a bot for some, random EHR that a group, specialty uses, that maybe we want to build 6 or 7 or 8 functions. So, there's some cost in that. Let's say you're going to spend $100,000 or $200,000. Well, that's too much for any one of those to do. But in kind of the co-op fractional ownership approach, you could take that to the next step. And you could sort of spread the cost out and get more leverage out of it, which I think is also related to the tools. The fancier tools have gotten more and more democratized. The desire for people to use those tools is, it's no longer oh, well, that's fancy stuff. I don't, where am I going to use RPA? Where am I going to use AI? People are now thinking, gosh, I would like to use that. And maybe they can't afford to on their own. But I think that co-op strategy goes really nicely with sort of the democratization of these more powerful tools. I hope to see more of that going forward so that everybody doesn't feel like they have to build their own version of everything all the time.
Right. No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I like I said, that co-op idea was just sort of off the top of my head earlier, but I'm wondering if it's a way that the smaller players can get access to some of these same technologies. But then your point about a lot of these technologies are either going to be embedded in offerings that you might already purchase, a Word or Google Docs or whatever, or they're free, through some platform or another. So I think the ability to get out there and experiment with the use of these these programs and tools is here, and is probably going to continue to evolve, I would guess, pretty rapidly over the next couple years.
It does feel like we've opened the Pandora's box on this stuff, right? So it does feel like all of a sudden now we went from, just going 5 miles an hour to, oh my gosh, there's a race here, let's hit the gas pedal. And there's going to be just kind of this Cambrian explosion of new capabilities that we always heard might be coming, but now they're starting to come online faster, which should be exciting if you're going to put them to use. Might be scary if you're trying to avoid them. Right.
No, I definitely agree with that. There's a feeling in the air, as it were, that there's been a corner turned when it comes to the AI development. And I don't know if that's just, it's more in the zeitgeist because of ChatGPT, or if it's truly a technical hurdle that ChatGPT overcame. But either way, whether it's merely a perception or just an action or is an actuality, either way, I think the public mind on it has turned a corner for sure.
Yeah.
Let me wrap with this then. We've been talking about, hey, if you want to get into healthcare tech, et cetera, let me be a little bit more generic in my closing question. Just what advice would you have to entrepreneurs? You've been an entrepreneur a few times, and I think a lot of folks, in my scores of listeners, I think there's some folks out there who want to be entrepreneurs, who want to be their own boss. What advice would you have to an entrepreneur today? Not necessarily limited to the tech space, just in general. Somebody who wants to go out there and start a business in 2023. You've done it a few times. What advice would you have for that type of individual?
Is your goal to create a lifestyle business or to create a company that, you're going to hire multiple employees and try and grow fast and raise money and ultimately sell? That, different paths, right? It's a great time to be a solopreneur. Because these tools that used to not be available to you as a solopreneur are now becoming available. If you learn to use them, then you could be really dominant in being a consultant who's sort of a tech-enabled consultant, so to speak. That can be very powerful for growing a good lifestyle business. You may end up never having to raise money, and you can do things that were otherwise impossible for you to do. You can be sort of an armchair data scientist now without actually knowing how to be a data scientist. That's pretty interesting. From a company perspective, it is more difficult now to raise money on a napkin, and you have to be more pragmatic. Honestly, I think this, we're both, we're not on the coast, right? So we don't have this expectation that, well, I have this idea, so therefore I need $5 million tomorrow. We have more of the mentality of, I'm going to need to prove something to somebody before they put $1 in, and how am I going to do that? And honestly, maybe that wasn't in vogue for the last several years, but now it is the playbook. So that means that you're going to have to build something probably on the back of a consultative engagement with an early customer, probably where you're leaning into providing more services and less software, but you're building the software based on what you learn from the services. That person who you're doing services for becomes essentially a beta customer of your software, but what they really bought was your consulting. But now they're using your software too. And then you say, okay, now I have a proven use case and a proven customer, and you've probably learned more than anybody ever would speculatively by doing it and building a tool that you're using yourself, in your engagement. Then you can go put a few dollars in the bank and take the next step, get a few more customers. But it's got to be much more methodical now. So you've got to build the MVP, so to speak, on the back of a paying customer. Probably you're providing some degree of consulting services to. I would say the downside of that, though, is you can't be 22 and do that. You can't be fresh out of college or wherever with no experience. No one's going to pay you to be a consultant. So you better know something that someone's going to pay you to do, upon which you can then build a solution from. So I think it's maybe a great time to have industry experience and either wanting to be sort of a tech-enabled consultant or to build a company on the back of a consulting engagement. Great time to do that. Not a great time to, be coming out of college thinking you're going to go raise money to go build a startup. So the advice to that young person is go as deep as you can into the nerdiest thing you can. If you want to go into healthcare, go learn how, fee schedules and contracts and 835s all go together. Go learn the most nerdy, data-driven part of the industry, and then you'll have enough knowledge to build something. But one of the things you see out of Silicon Valley now, maybe historically and a little bit now, is sort of we'll just bring technology to the field and we'll be successful. And how many times have we seen the Silicon Valley funded startup completely fail because they didn't actually understand the nuance of healthcare? You've got to go in reverse and get the experience first. Yep. So that would be my core advice.
Okay, wonderful. Well, John Williamson, thank you for taking me from, what the heck AI is and how do we see through the smoke and mirrors that are sometimes put out there to sell products and really get to where there's going to be value, to whether we need to be afraid of the forthcoming AI overlords or, how to get started or your journey in getting started in healthcare tech and some advice to entrepreneurs out there. I've enjoyed the conversation. I hope listeners out there, you got something from it. John, thanks for being with me here on No Bad Questions.
Really enjoyed it. Thanks, David. Have a great day. Bye-bye.